This video is the fifth in a series where I intend to gather some wild clay, make a pot, fire it to earthenware in a wood fire, then use it as a cooking vessel to prepare a meal, again in a wood fire. Although this is the fifth video in the series, we're not yet at the part where we have usable pots for cooking. So this is still part 2.5 or something. I'll need to make some more pots ready for another round of firing. Fortunately, I still have a lot of clay left. A very large amount of unrefined raw clay, plus enough sand-tempered clay for probably 2 pots, and enough pure clay for at least 1. The mistakes I think I need to think about from the 2 large pots that failed are: the thicker walled pots were the ones that failed, so I'll make them with thinner walls. I think this is the number one reason for failure. The inside of the pots cooled at a different rate to the outside, and when the walls are thick, that exerts tension on the outside surface, which is almost guaranteed to cause a crack, as this clay, even when fired, is going to be very weak under tension. During the build, my clay was too wet and soft. I think this was part of the reason why the pot walls were so thick. Anything thinner just felt like it was collapsing, so I'm going to try to use clay that's drier and more firm. My notes for firing, which will be hopefully in the next episode, are the big pots didn't seem like they were fully fired in all parts, so I will fire the pots for longer, in a larger fire, keeping them hotter for longer, although I think making the walls of the pots thinner will also help. And the cracking might have only occurred at the end when the bottom parts of the pots were exposed above the embers, so I won't let them cool off unevenly at the end of firing. I aim to end up with them covered with embers and ashes completely. Maybe I'll even put a layer of turf over the top and leave it like that until the next day, until they're cool enough to handle. Just to cover a couple of things that a lot of people suggested, but I don't think I need to address just yet. Drying. A few people I think assumed on the basis that the first 3 episodes were weekly that maybe I hadn't let the pots dry enough. In reality, there was a real-time interval of about 3 weeks between making the big pots and firing them. I'm fairly sure they were good and dry, because also I think if moisture was the issue, we'd have seen more spalling of the surface. What we actually saw was structural cracking, which I think is more about even and complete heating and wall thickness. A lot of people suggested using a kiln. I'm not going to do that because I'm trying to keep this as basic as possible. I know a kiln is a more reliable way to do it, but I don't have space to build one in my own garden, and I think it would be a bit too much to ask to build one at Steve and Julia's orchard. Besides, the soil there is sandy, so I would have to haul in materials in there to build a kiln. So I'm going to stick with pit firing, but I will dig a slightly deeper pit this time, and I'll make sure the pots don't get partially exposed like they did last time. So I have some fired broken pots. I'm going to select the reddest bits of these, which I think are the most fired, and grind them up to make some grog to go into the next batch of clay. The result is this stuff that looks like brown sand, and just as a test I added a small amount of water to it so we can see that it doesn't turn sticky at all, which indicates at the very least that it's been fired a bit. Now a bit of a dilemma. This is all the refined clay I have left, and from the first firing the pot made from ungrogged refined clay was arguably the most pot-like result that survived. So I'm going to take a risk here and make my first larger pot with just the refined clay, no additional grog or temper. It's quite a bit drier than it was last time. In fact, maybe it's a little bit too dry, and I had a couple of abortive attempts at rolling a piece out and pressing it into a lined form. That didn't work, so instead I decided to make a largish pinch pot and then add coils onto the top of it. That attempt went all more or less without a hitch. There were some times when the clay felt like it was cracking and splitting, but this clay, even when refined like this, lacks a bit of plasticity. I blended and smoothed and pressed and consolidated the material together and kept adding coils, blending them and smoothing them until I had a fairly tall sort of egg-shaped pot. The walls here are only about 4 or 5 millimeters thick and they're pretty even. As the rim started to come inwards again, I realised I'm not going to be able to get my hand inside the finished pot, especially if it shrinks a bit on drying, so I'll smooth out the inside now with my pieces of clamshell and fingertips. The inside of this pot won't be burnished smooth, but it's still possible to cook in rough, unglazed earthenware, if this ends up staying in one piece, that is. Once it had dried for an hour or 2, I was able to smooth off the outside some more with wooden sticks and consolidate and trim the lip a little bit more. I'll keep an eye on this as it dries, but I think this one is more or less complete. I don't want to score or impress any marks in these pots that might introduce a weakness that propagates into a crack, so I'll make the pots all slightly different shapes. Kind of hard not to do that anyway, and each shape will be made from a different blend of clay. For the next one I'm using a mixture of my sand-tempered clay plus some grog. Quite a lot of grog. It looks like soil, doesn't it? Well, it should. It was ground this morning. Wait a minute, that doesn't really work because clay is from the ground. Never mind. I worked in the grog and the result feels quite a lot like the shell-grogged clay I made in a previous episode, but I can already tell this stuff is going to be a challenge to work. Despite still being a bit on the soft side, it's also quite crumbly and doesn't hold together well. I suppose sand temper plus potsherd grog is probably just spreading the clay minerals a bit too thin. But oh well, we have to try. I initially thought I'd start with a pinch pot and add coils, but it was so limp and weak that I decided to use a bare wooden bowl as a form. I bought this in a charity shop for 50p, someone's first wood turning project I think. In Native American pottery this would be called a puki, and this technique occurs in other traditions too. Sometimes the form can just be a neat dish-shaped hole in dry, hard, packed ground. I dropped my pinch pot into the bowl and pressed it down. Ideally, it should have been big enough that the rim of the pot protrudes above the lip of the bowl. Then coils of clay can be blended on easily, but that didn't seem to happen. So I'm just going to blend them on the inside down there and deal with the external seam later. I kept on adding material and shaping and smoothing, and this double-grogged clay fought me all the way. It keeps on splitting and sagging, but I think if I dry it more, it will just split even more. I ended up with a fairly rough-looking bowl that I decided to leave overnight to firm up. I wasn't all that sure it was going to release from the wooden form, but it did, but what a mess. I added some more bits of clay to try to close up some cracks on the outside, but the movement caused new cracks on the inside, so I tidied it up as best as I could and left it to dry some more. I can still infill with a bit more clay when it's drier. In all honesty, it would be a miracle if this pot survives firing, but nothing ventured, nothing gained. Next, I'm going to make a pot with the raw unrefined clay, literally as it was when I dug it out of the ground in my neighbour's garden. You can see streaks of different coloured sand and clay minerals in there, as well as other stuff. I wedged it for a while, during which time several fairly big pieces of stone surfaced, so I picked them out. There are, no doubt, more of these in smaller form still in the clay, but it didn't seem to cause any problem last time. The raw clay pot did crack in firing, but I don't think inclusions were the cause. Apart from the rocks in it, this clay might actually be close to the ideal consistency, or at least the best we can get from this clay body. More on that a little bit later. I reckon if this stuff was worked through a mesh screen to exclude the rocks, it would probably be good to go. I think pinch pots plus coils is turning out to be my favourite method, so I'll do that again here. As I made the pinch pot, a couple more pieces of grit emerged, so I picked them out and infilled with a bit of extra clay. This clay is firm, but when it's worked as thin as this, it tends to get a bit floppy. But it has fairly good wet strength, so it might look like I'm handling this pot a bit uncarefully, but it is okay. I added a few layers of coils on the top and worked them into the sides, then pinched them together, then lots and lots of smoothing, evening out and blending the bits I'd missed, a little bit of extra clay here and there, and then I gently tapped the bowl down onto its rim to even it out. Then I drew out the shape a bit wider with my clamshell smoothing tool, a bit more smoothing with my fingers. I could add more coils to this, but I think it will get unviably floppy, so I'm going to leave it to dry out and firm up a bit. Let's just check back in on the egg-shaped purified clay pot. It's lovely and firm, and already almost makes a slight ringing sound when it's tapped, even though it's still green clay. There are lots of vertical marks on the outside where I smoothed it off with sticks and such, and I think I'm going to leave these marks there as a decorative surface finish. The only problems I'm having with this pot is that it's rather unstable when it's stood right side up. This won't be a problem once it's fired, as if it survives to the cooking pot stage, it'll be nestled into a bed of embers anyway. My only concern is that if I stand it upright to dry it, it could very easily get knocked over and roll right off the drying board. So I'll put it in a cardboard box when it's drying right side up. I said I'd talk a little bit more about the clay I'm using. As I mentioned in a couple of previous episodes, there's a significant tradition of brickmaking in the area, using this local clay, but not a lot of a tradition of pottery. And looking at the most successful pot that survived the last firing, which was made from refined clay, that is, with a lot of the sand and larger grain materials taken out, it's still really porous. It feels quite light for a piece of pottery, and it has a texture that I can really only describe as bricky. I'll talk a bit more about this while we watch this fumbly doofus trying to extend the raw clay pot. So what's actually going on here, and why is this clay so bricky? Well, I think some of the clay in my clay isn't clay at all. Some of the fine grain material that feels sticky and slippery and fine probably isn't actual clay and doesn't fuse or sinter together when it's fired. In fact, I think some of it might be burning out. I suppose if there are minerals such as iron sulfide in there, which is possible, then the sulfur might be just burning off. The iron would still be left behind, probably in oxide form, but if there's material actually burning out of the clay, the result might be a more porous and open texture like I'm seeing. None of this matters very much for making ordinary bricks. In fact, lightweight, slightly porous bricks are easy to build with and bond well with mortar. They would be slightly susceptible to frost spalling, but historically that wasn't a problem people cared about a whole lot. So yeah, I think this clay contains some clay-like but non-clay minerals. Certainly I can smell things when I work with it. Not unpleasant, just faintly swampy. A little bit of sulphur and other things that smell like hot pennies and so on. The fact that I can smell anything at all suggests my clay isn't entirely made of clay, and I think some of that stuff that isn't clay is being driven off during firing. Anyway, the raw clay pot firmed up in just a few hours, so I've rolled some more coils of clay and added them to the rim, blended them in, smoothed it all out, and as I work on this, the previously firm clay tends to loosen up a little bit, so the pot is gradually acquiring a flatter, broader bottom, which I don't mind and I'm not going to try to correct. As I was smoothing out the clay, I kept encountering pieces of grit. I picked them out and refilled the space with more clay and blended it over thoroughly, which I hope will work. It seems almost inevitable that there will be more pieces of grit buried and undiscovered in the walls somewhere, although the walls are a lot thinner this time, so I think I've found any of the big pieces. By the time this extra bit of pot wall was added, the pot was now quite slack again, so I shan't try to extend it any further just yet. I'll give it another period of setting and maybe work on it some more in the morning. I covered the pot loosely with plastic so it will dry a bit, but not overly. The next morning I added a couple more coils of clay to the rim of this wild clay pot, just to bring the profile inward a little bit. Then the usual blending, smoothing, discovery and removal of chunks of grit, infilling and more smoothing. Then I added a final coil on the outside lip to create a rim that curves outward, but without increasing the wall thickness. The last pots had rims that were thick and just sat on top of the pot. This is more like the wall of the pot flaring outward, or at least it will be when it's done. Next we'll go back to that double-grogged pot, which is finally firm enough to handle, but has some alarming cracks and blemishes. I filled these in as best I could, but I really think this one is highly likely to break in firing. The wall thickness is greater than I wanted, and it's just a bit of a disappointment in general. On the off chance that this ugly duckling of a pot happens to be the only one that makes it through firing, I decided to coat the inside with some of the raw clay, which is a bit smoother and more coherent, really only so that if I do have to cook in this one, I maybe won't have to eat quite so much grit. So now, working with the sand-tempered clay with no additional grog, I rolled out a roughly circular slab for a base. Then I added a coil around the edge, and then I thought maybe let's build up the edge a bit faster by rolling out some slabs and just plonking them on there. Fewer joins would have been ideal, but we are where we are. Now, in case you're wondering why I often work in such a weird way like this, I'm sort of doing it on purpose. Not that I'm making this wrong and rough on purpose, but I'm deliberately being casual and almost careless about the thing, kind of daydreaming with my hands. This, for me, is like taking the scenic route to a destination. It's not the most efficient way to get to the end, but the end is only one part. All of these interesting little discoveries, failures, sidetracks and lessons don't necessarily happen if you try to go just directly to the goal via the same route that everyone else travels. As a case in point, while I was working on the smoothing and blending, a leaf fell from the oak tree in my garden, landing right there in front of me. I was about to throw it away when I thought, actually no, let's just press it into the clay here at the bottom of this pot and leave it there to make an imprint. Ah, an oak leaf! That's what Steph's wonky pot reminded me of. Why, what did you think I meant? And also this leaf gave me an idea for another potentially interesting diversion, which I'll come back to in just a moment. Once the walls were sort of joined and blended, I really didn't like the look of this pot, so I decided to make the walls wavy, or if you prefer, crinkle-crankle, or if you really insist, wingle-wangle. And then I decided to make them lean in a bit too, so if you were to bake a quiche in this dish, you'd never get it out in one piece. It ended up quite a monstrosity, but it might become lovable once it's tidied up and smoothed in the leather hard stage. And anyway, I have 3 other pots, 2 of which I even like, so there's room for a little bit of fun. Speaking of which, here's that idea I mentioned. I took some of the raw unrefined clay and rolled it out. This piece hasn't even been blended and wedged, so if you look carefully you can still see the grey and yellow marbling of different minerals and components in it. I rolled another piece to roughly the same shape and size, then I found a nice leaf and sandwiched it between the 2 pieces of clay, pressing down firmly. It's joined at the edges, but the leaf is preventing the 2 flat pieces from properly uniting. I am expecting this piece to fail, but I'm hoping it will fail by splitting into 2 plates where the leaf separates the clay from sticking together. And I'm hoping this will happen fairly late in firing, after the leaf imprint is permanently fixed in the fired clay, as well as when some of the carbon and other stuff in the leaf has burned into the clay itself. What I'm trying to make here is a bit like an artificial fossil, or as I like to call it, an artifosso. Will it work? Who knows? I was going to stop here for this video, but let's do one more pot using wild clay. I started by breaking the clay into smallish pieces and flattening it out between my fingers, which is a good way to find the larger pieces of stone and grit. And for this I'm going to use a little bit more of my ground potsherd grog from the last firing, but not as much as I tried to work into that sandy clay in the other pot. So just like a handful of this grog worked and wedged into this big lump of clay. For this pot I'm going to try again using a form or pookie to see if I can get that right this time. But I'll line it this time with a piece of stretchy cheesecloth, which hopefully won't wrinkle a lot as the clay presses into the form. So I took a little bit less than half of the clay, formed it into a ball, and then flattened and rolled it out between two plastic bags using an empty wine bottle for the rolling. Then I pressed this into the form on top of the cheesecloth. A bit like in pastry making, it's not all about pushing it down into the concavity, but also a lot about lifting up the edges and letting it fall in without tearing or stretching too much. Smoothing this out with one of my clamshell scrapers sort of moves the clay upward, extending the height of the pot, but still I needed to add a bit of extra clay here and there. My original intention was to make 2 of these bowls, then join them rim to rim to make a spherical pot body, then cut the lid piece out of the top once the clay is hardened up. So I made another bowl in more or less the same way, but there is a bit of a problem. I couldn't find 2 form bowls the same size. So when I join these, there's going to be a bit of an overhang. I tried to remedy that with an extra coil of clay added round the rim, but when I went to put the 2 pieces together, I misaligned them a bit, and then when I was blending the edges, I accidentally caved in the side a bit. Not going well. Normally I think you'd wait for the clay to be firmer, but this clay starts to lose a lot of pliability at that point, so I couldn't really wait. Anyway, that was all a bit of a disaster, so I cut the 2 halves apart again, then sat and figured out what to do next. I thought if I take the smaller bowl out of the form, I might be able to ease the rim out a little bit to make it fit the other one. So I tried that and it sort of worked, but when I went to pick it up, the bottom was stuck on the board and it tore out completely. Foiled again. I decided just to forge ahead, so I mated the 2 rims, then cut out a circle where the tear was. This means I can get my hand inside to support the inside of the join, while I press on the outside and blend it together. Lots more blending and smoothing and blending. The good thing with using a nearly hemispherical bowl for the form is that I can just tug on the cheesecloth at one side and it will tilt the piece in order to work on the join without distorting the rest of the pot. Then I made a roll of clay and added it to the top rim of the pot, blended it in and smoothed it, then a bit more smoothing of the join inside and out, scraping, smoothing, blending. And I do definitely need to leave this to firm up before I even think about pulling it out of the bottom form to smooth out the cloth marks. One more thing, at this stage it's still possible for me to fit my entire hand through the neck of this pot. So let's make a mental note of that, because I think once this is dry it will shrink so as to make that no longer possible. That does mean that I have to get the inside looking nice before it shrinks too much, but for now I'll cover it with a bit of cloth and let it firm up and dry just a little. Meanwhile, that weird wavy dish is just past leather hard, so I trimmed off some of the rough edges and pieces with a knife. I'll give it some more smoothing and sanding with the rough pebble when it's nearly completely dry. And once that last pot I made had hardened up a little bit, I was able to carefully take it out of the form in order to smooth out the marks on the base. And on the inside as well as to round out the shape a bit more by smoothing the inside with a spoon against my hand supporting the outside. This pot is actually turning out to be my favourite shape out of all of them. So here we are at the end of part 2.5 with 3 fairly nice pots, one that is quirky and silly and useless, and another one that is a grotesque monster. Plus the artificial fossil experiment, which when I get to firing I'll try and place it a little bit away from the nice pots in case it goes boom. We'll need a couple of weeks of drying now, but some of that time will have already elapsed by the time you're seeing this video, so hopefully it won't be a long wait until firing day. I hope this has been interesting, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.